Hey North State, Chief Meteorologist Preston Donion here talking about this dastardly December dry streak that we are rolling into and seeing no end to, right? We were doing great with rainfall all throughout the region until about that week before Thanksgiving, and then it just dried out. And we're now sitting at 13 days without measurable rainfall in Redding with no expectation of getting any back within at least the next week. So that dry streak likely continue to 20 plus days. What does this mean for us? Is this going to be a dry year? Are we totally screwed when it comes to hitting that rainfall estimate when it comes to the end of the year? Well, there's history of this, and we can look at that for some context clues, and we can also look at what's expected for the rest of this year. So let's start with that history. This has happened many times before. Through Redding's history of records going back to 1893, there have been 15 years with a dry streak of 20 plus days that ended in December. Now, there's plenty of other dry streaks that ended in January or November that are relevant, but we're really looking at this December time frame, right? What does that portend for the rest of the winter season if it ends here in the early goings? Now, there's 15 years where that's happened with 20 plus days of dry weather in a row. 10 of those years finished their water year with below normal rainfall relative to the average for that 30-year period, right? We're not talking about 1910 and comparing that to rainfall now. We're talking about comparing that to the rainfall that was registered downtown from 1900 to 1930. So again, 15 years where we've seen these long dry streaks. 10 of them finished the season below normal in terms of rainfall. 5 of them finished well below normal. Now, what's my distinction on that? When we talk about below normal, that's just simply below that normal rainfall for that year. In the 1900s, before we moved to the Redding airport, that was typically around 38 to 40 inches. So coming in below that. If you're well below, you're more than 10 inches below that normal rainfall. And if you're very far below, you're going to be about 20 plus inches below normal rainfall. And that only happened in 2 cases out of those 15 years with this 20 plus day dry streak that ended in December. So it's fairly rare to end up really, really behind. But it is fairly often that when we end up with these long dry streaks, we do end up behind in general. Now, there are exceptions to that, right? I'm looking at my notes here, and we have in a couple years, some really impressive performances. In fact, in 1940, there were 37 days in a row ending on December 14th with no rain, and we ended up more than 20 inches above normal rainfall. We saw above normal rainfall out there in 1988 after a 20-day dry streak. We saw above normal rainfall in 2003 after a 3-week dry streak. So it doesn't necessarily tell us everything, but there is generally that expectation that when you take 3 weeks out of your wet season and don't drop anything in there, yeah, you're probably going to end up behind the 8 ball when all's said and done. So wouldn't set your expectations too high for another wet year across the region, but how dry we're going to be, that's still up in the air. And it's worth looking at these outlooks from the Climate Prediction Center for the extended. What's expected out of this weak La Nina pattern that's expected to transition out as we head into late winter? Well, we're still expected to see pretty typical precipitation conditions here in the North State for winter. So we're going to be able to get a chance to get back on track. Of course, these long-range forecasts are useless in terms of fine-level detail, but there are still good signs. This isn't going to be a total dry winter. This isn't going to be a 2020 all over again, but it is probably going to come in a little bit below your typical rain gauge for a water year when all's said and done.